There is a quiet moment that happens in ordinary lives, usually late at night when the noise fades and the numbers stay. A screen glows softly. A balance sits there, neither dramatic nor impressive, just a number that carries more weight than it should. In that moment, a question surfaces that most people never say out loud. Is this all it's ever going to be? For years, progress feels invisible. Effort goes in, time moves forward, yet the distance between where you are and where you want to be barely shrinks. The climb feels endless, like walking through fog without landmarks. Days turn into years, and the only proof of movement is exhaustion. Many assume this is how it works forever: steady labor, slow accumulation, no turning point. But history, mathematics, and lived experience all say otherwise. Growth does not unfold evenly. It bends, it compresses, it waits. There are specific thresholds, financial milestones, where the rules quietly change. Before them, momentum is fragile. After them, it becomes difficult to stop. These moments are not emotional, they are mechanical. Numbers cross certain lines, and suddenly time works differently. Effort begins to echo instead of vanish. Most people never reach the first milestone, not because it is unreachable, but because they quit just before it reshapes everything. They mistake the slow phase for failure. They assume the silence means nothing is happening. In reality, they are standing inches from a shift they cannot yet see. Not about overnight success, not about luck or inheritance, about accumulation reaching scale. About 3 milestones that separate constant struggle from accelerating progress. About why the early years feel cruel, why the middle years feel surreal, and why the later years feel unreal to those who never believed they were possible. Every long road has markers. Miss them, and the journey feels endless. Reach them, and the terrain itself changes. The first milestone has a number attached to it, but its real weight isn't numerical. It is psychological. Crossing $100,000 does not feel like arrival. It feels like something quietly unlocking. Before this point, progress depends almost entirely on force. Every contribution matters because without it, nothing moves. Growth feels fragile. Miss time, miss effort, and the entire structure pauses. This is the stage where patience is tested hardest, because the work feels louder than the results. Reaching $100,000 changes that balance. At this level, accumulation begins to show behavior. The total no longer rises only when effort is applied. Time itself starts participating. Growth appears in places you didn't actively touch. It's subtle, almost unconvincing at first, but it is undeniable once noticed. This is why the first $100,000 is widely considered the most difficult stretch, not because it requires brilliance or extreme sacrifice, but because it demands faith in outcomes that arrive late. Many abandon the process just before this point, mistaking slow movement for failure. What makes this milestone powerful is not what it provides, but what it removes. Doubt weakens. Momentum becomes harder to kill. The pressure to constantly push eases slightly, replaced by continuity. It still requires discipline. It still demands restraint. But it no longer feels like starting over every year. The past begins contributing instead of fading. Crossing $100,000 does not mean comfort. It does not mean freedom. It means the system is now working with you instead of against you. This is the line where accumulation stops being theoretical and starts behaving predictably, where effort finally leaves a lasting imprint. After crossing $100,000, the shift isn't dramatic on the surface. There's no parade, no sudden upgrade in lifestyle. In fact, from the outside, nothing looks different at all. But internally, something important has changed. This is the point where money stops feeling fragile. Before this milestone, every unexpected expense feels personal. A repair, a bill, a delay. Each one threatens progress. But once 6 figures are reached, volatility loses its power. Setbacks still happen, but they no longer reset the clock. Recovery becomes faster. Stability becomes noticeable. At this level, growth begins to come from two directions at once. New contributions still matter, but existing capital starts pulling its own weight. Even modest market movement creates visible change. Progress is no longer invisible between statements. More importantly, decision-making evolves. Choices stop being reactive. You no longer need perfect timing to survive mistakes. Risk can be evaluated instead of feared. This doesn't mean recklessness. It means optionality. You can wait. You can pass. You can adjust without panic. This milestone also changes how time is perceived. Before $100,000, the future feels distant and abstract. After it, timelines compress. Goals feel reachable rather than theoretical. The gap between effort and reward narrows just enough to stay motivating. Many people believe wealth is built by dramatic leaps. In reality, it's built when small advantages stop disappearing. At $100,000, advantages finally stick. This is why those who reach this point rarely fall back to zero. Momentum exists now. Not fast momentum, but reliable momentum. The foundation is no longer soft. And with that foundation in place, the next phase isn't about proving discipline anymore. It's about scale. Somewhere around $650,000, the relationship with money changes again, but this time it's louder. At this level, the numbers start speaking for themselves. The account no longer grows quietly in the background. Movement becomes noticeable. Even ordinary years produce results that once felt impossible. This milestone introduces a powerful realization. Money can now carry part of the load of living. Returns at this level aren't symbolic anymore. They resemble portions of an income. Not enough to completely replace work, but enough to soften dependence on it. Enough to create breathing room. Enough to change how decisions feel in real time. This is where fear loosens its grip. Losing a job no longer feels like falling off a cliff. It feels like stepping onto a ledge with options. Time becomes flexible. Urgency fades. You're no longer forced to accept every condition, every demand, every compromise simply to stay afloat. Psychologically, this is one of the most important stages. Before this point, wealth is something being built. After it, wealth becomes something that supports. Even partially, that support changes posture. Shoulders relax. Sleep improves. The background anxiety that once hummed constantly starts to quiet. This is also where patience becomes easier. At $650,000, progress no longer depends entirely on sacrifice. The system is doing real work now. Growth happens even when nothing new is added. That compounding effect, once theoretical, has become tangible. Many people never reach this point because they underestimate how long the early stages take and overestimate how dramatic the finish will look. But this middle ground is where resilience is born. You're not finished, not even close. But for the first time, you're no longer fragile. After crossing $650,000, something subtle but profound happens. The change isn't loud. There's no sudden celebration, no dramatic announcement. Instead, it shows up quietly, in decisions that no longer feel heavy. At this level, money stops being reactive. Before this point, most financial choices are defensive. How to avoid falling behind, how to keep pace, how to absorb the next surprise without damage. But now, the question shifts. It becomes less about survival and more about direction. Small freedoms appear first. Work is no longer the only pillar holding everything up. Income still matters, but it isn't singular. The pressure to say yes, to overtime, to exhaustion, to roles that drain more than they give, begins to weaken. Choices widen. This milestone introduces leverage, not the flashy kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that lets you wait, the kind that allows walking away, the kind that changes negotiations before a word is spoken. When money no longer demands immediate attention, time re-enters the equation, and time is powerful. At $650,000, growth accelerates in a different way. The account no longer depends on constant input to move forward. Even average years generate meaningful progress. The system compounds without effort, without emotion, without fatigue. This is where confidence replaces urgency. Plans stretch longer. Risks are measured instead of feared. Opportunities are evaluated calmly rather than grabbed desperately. You begin to notice how many decisions others make under pressure. Pressure you no longer feel the same way. It's not wealth in the cinematic sense, it's sturdiness, a financial structure that holds under weight. And once that structure exists, the next milestone stops feeling distant. It stops feeling abstract. It becomes inevitable. The moment the number turns into seven figures doesn't arrive with fireworks. There's no dramatic pause, no music swelling in the background. It often appears quietly, almost anticlimactically, on an ordinary day. But the effect is anything but ordinary. $1 million. The relationship with money shifts permanently. Not because everything is solved, but because the floor beneath life finally feels solid. The fear of collapse fades. Not entirely, but enough to stop dominating every thought. This milestone represents scale. Until now, growth has been impressive but incremental. At this level, movement becomes noticeable even without effort. Market fluctuations that once felt terrifying now register as noise. Down years no longer threaten the future. Up years accelerate it beyond expectation. The most striking change is psychological. Money stops feeling fragile. It no longer seems like something that could vanish overnight with one bad decision. Instead, it becomes resilient, capable of absorbing mistakes, delays, even detours. This is where patience becomes effortless. Waiting no longer feels like sacrifice. Long-term thinking becomes natural. Decisions stretch across decades instead of months. The future stops being a vague concern and starts feeling reachable. At $1 million, income is optional, not unnecessary but optional. Work becomes a choice instead of a requirement. Time regains its value. Days feel less compressed. Weeks feel wider. And something else happens quietly. Comparison disappears. There's no longer a need to measure progress against others. The scoreboard fades. The focus turns inward to structure, preservation, direction. Growth becomes intentional rather than reactive. This is not an ending, it's a threshold, one that separates accumulation from multiplication. And beyond it, the numbers behave very differently. After the first million, effort and outcome no longer move at the same speed. Before this point, progress required constant input. Saving had to be deliberate. Decisions mattered immediately. A single mistake felt expensive. But beyond this threshold, the system begins to carry itself. Growth becomes asymmetrical. Small percentage changes now represent large absolute numbers. A year that feels average on paper can quietly add more than entire early decades of progress combined. Time, not effort, becomes the primary driver. This is where wealth starts behaving differently from income. Income depends on presence. Wealth depends on structure. Once the structure is strong enough, it no longer needs constant attention to perform. It compounds whether the owner is busy or not, whether they are working or resting, whether they are watching or not. Risk perception also shifts. Decisions once avoided become manageable. Opportunities can be evaluated calmly instead of desperately. There is room for patience, for waiting, for saying no. Pressure recedes, replaced by clarity. Another subtle change occurs here. Restraint becomes powerful. The urge to chase every opportunity fades. Growth no longer requires urgency. Preservation begins to matter as much as expansion. The goal shifts from more to sustainable. This is why many who reach this level accelerate further. Not because they suddenly work harder, but because fewer mistakes compound in their favor. Avoided losses matter as much as captured gains. Stability itself becomes a multiplier. Time regains its original meaning. Weeks are no longer traded for money. Years are no longer compressed by urgency. Decisions stretch forward instead of inward. Life becomes designable. This is the quiet truth rarely discussed. The first million is not about lifestyle. It's about leverage over time. Direction matters more than numbers. These milestones aren't luck or talent. They're the result of time and consistency. Progress is quiet before it becomes obvious, which is why most people quit early. Time will pass either way. The difference is intention. These milestones are signals that momentum has shifted and patience has begun working in your favor.